Welcome to Brand Nevat. We are delighted to be rejoined by one of our favorite guests. Brian Leiter has just produced an excellent book on Marx, which he's co-written with Jamie Edwards. Jamie will be joining us for a further episode. But Brian, would you like to start with a thought experiment?
So Marx often refers to the situation of workers under capitalism in the 19th century as wage slavery. And of course, the 19th century marks the end pretty much of chattel slavery, right? Where people are owned as property, right? And Marx is being provocative when he describes workers under capitalism as in fact being not chattel slaves, but wage slaves. Um, and of course, it's meant to be a little startling because, of course, the official picture is people are free in the marketplace to negotiate for a job. They either accept the job or they don't accept the job, and so on. So it looks to be, as it were, paradigmatically free. But Marx's view is that most workers under capitalism, not necessarily all, but most are in fact wage slaves. They are unfree in their labor. And why does he think that? And I think the way to understand it is to think of it in terms of a thought experiment, which is how we actually do it in the book. That is, ask yourself the following question about whatever job it is you do, which is, would you in fact do this work that you're doing if you did not need the wage in order to survive? And if the answer is no, then you are, for Marx's purposes, a wage slave. And the contrast is with work or productive activity that people engage in, to use Marxist terms, spontaneously. Doesn't mean they just all of a sudden do it. It means that it's work they do regardless of whether they are paid to do it, right? A good example is what you guys do on this show, right? You're not getting paid. You're not getting rich from doing this. You all have day jobs and so on, okay? You do it because you want to do it, right? It is free labor in the sense it is something you want to do. You're not doing it because you're being paid. The situation of most workers under capitalism is a situation of unfree labor. As I said, not all, right? One reason it's so difficult to get a job as a professor is because a lot of our labor is relatively free, right? That is, I would still teach courses even if I wasn't being paid for it, right? Assuming I had my other needs met, of course. So as a professor, it's a mixed bag, right? There are certain things, committee meetings, administrative tasks that I have to get paid for. I would not do that spontaneously. But many other things I do completely spontaneously. As I often say to my students, though, think of the people who are cleaning the bathrooms in the law school, right? Their labor is not spontaneous. I'm pretty confident that left to their own devices and without the need to earn a wage, they would not show up to scrub toilets. Okay? And that's the reality of most labor under the current economic system. Of course, it's the situation of most labor historically too, though Marx's analysis of it in economic systems prior to capitalism is a bit different, and maybe we'll end up talking about that. So that's the thought experiment I invite everyone to undertake in thinking about whether their labor is free labor.
So I wonder whether there are two false dilemmas, perhaps. So the one is either you'll earn what you're earning now from your current job, or you'll earn nothing. And so you are forced into doing what you're doing now. But of course, there's a lot of alternatives to what you're doing now. There's not just either what you're doing now or nothing. And a second false dilemma here is that it assumes that the labor is uniform. So either the labor is uniform or it's not. And the assumption is it's uniform because if it wasn't, you wouldn't be doing the work at all. So there'd be no work happening. And so you are a wage slave in the sense that if you do any of that work at all, it's all wage slavery. But you might enjoy some part of your job. Like you said, some parts of your job may be spontaneous. You don't like, let's say, the committee meetings, but you enjoy some of the lecturing or some of the writing. So it could be the case that by Marx's definition, you are a wage slave because you wouldn't be doing the job as a whole, but you might be doing bits of it. And most jobs will contain bits that are not too bad.
Okay, so I don't know if most contain bits that aren't too bad, and I'm not sure, but we can come back to that. But let me say on the second so-called false dilemma, I wasn't making the assumption of uniformity. As you note, my own example illustrates the fact that there are jobs people can have, right, some of which they would do spontaneously in Marx's sense, and some of which they do only because they need the wage, right? So that is certainly a feature of certain kinds of work. Now, Marx is writing in the middle of the 19th century, and he has a particular paradigm of work in mind, which is the dominant form in Europe at the time. It's still not true of everyone, right? But the dominant form that he's thinking of, right, this is 100 years into the Industrial Revolution, is work in factories. Okay? He's very influenced by his occasional, actually frequent co-author, Friedrich Engels' book about the condition of the working class in England, right? Engels, as some of your listeners may know, came from a relatively wealthy industrial family, which is why he was able not to be a wage slave and spend his time writing communist tracts with Marx. And also he supported Marx for a certain period of time. But the portrayal of the lives of the working class in Manchester was pretty grim. Right? It was pretty grim. There, it didn't seem like there was anything particularly enjoyable, as it were, about what they were doing. It was pure wage slavery. Okay? One of the things that has changed, among others, in the 175 years since, is that there are more different kinds of jobs available under capitalism, at least to some people, right? And that many of them are not slavery in toto, right? Because they vary. And there are some aspects of a job that one does for the money, and there are some aspects that one would do regardless. Of course, the other big difference, right? And this, in a way, will get us back to your first dilemma, or first so-called false dilemma, is that the wages are much better than they once were for certain kinds of jobs. Certainly my kind of job, lawyers' wages are generally pretty good compared to other jobs. Right? It's still the case that the labor can be unfree even when the wages are very good. Okay? And, I teach law students, among others, but mainly law students. And many of them will go work in very large law firms and will earn very high salaries fresh out of law school. And it's not hard to convince them that most of their labor is unfree because it's pretty grueling. Most of it is not stuff they particularly want to do. I'm not saying that's true for all of them, but it's not an uncommon experience. Again, a feature of law practice in the United States, especially graduates of very elite law schools like the University of Chicago, is they join very large firms for very high salaries, and almost none of them stay around till the partnership decision 6, 7, 8 years later, right? They burn out, right? And the burnout is precisely that, yes, the money's very good, but they are very unfree, right? That's the way Marx would put it, right? They're unhappy, right? Because most of what they're doing, they don't want to do. Okay, so I agree with you on the second so-called false dilemma, but I'm not making that assumption. Now, on the first one, it is certainly the case that if you have a choice, a genuine choice, right, between laboring spontaneously or laboring merely for a wage, right, then you probably, first of all, in Marx's, you're not going to choose laboring for a wage, okay, at all. You'll labor spontaneously instead. But secondly, if you have that choice, then the labor isn't unfree. I mean, that's what follows from this particular kind of analysis. And that then raises the question, how many people actually have this kind of choice, right? More have it now than had it in the mid-19th century. That seems right, okay? Marx, as you know from other parts of the book, his view was that the logic of how capitalist markets work, and maybe that's something we ought to talk a little bit about, means that the long-term trend is not going to be the happy one of the last 100 years. The long-term trend is going to be more people in a situation of being forced to choose between doing work they don't want to do in order to survive versus having the opportunity to do work spontaneously. And that's based on claims about basically the logic of capitalist markets. Many of his assumptions about the logic of capitalist markets he shares with Milton Friedman, as I like to say. he foresees certain consequences that Milton Friedman didn't think too systematically about. But we can go into that now, or we can come back to that issue.
It strikes me as incorrect, though, that if you have a choice between spontaneous labor and wage slavery, that you would always choose spontaneous labor, even most of the time, because spontaneous work is often not well paid. So it would pay you enough, perhaps, to survive, but it won't pay you nearly as much as the high-flying job where you can't get to go to weddings or see your children very often. And people still choose that very regularly. They choose to climb up the corporate ladder.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting phenomenon, and I should say, right, when I said people, if they have a choice between spontaneous labor and wage slavery, they will choose spontaneous labor, but that's against the background assumption of having sufficient resources that they don't need the wage slavery. Okay, now your example is of a special case of this, where it's a choice between spontaneous labor that doesn't pay as well as the wage slavery, right? And people choose the wage slavery. And I don't want to deny that there are some people who may, in fact, choose the wage slavery under those circumstances. There's a couple of questions we have to ask about that. First of all, I'm not sure it has much bearing on the question whether or not their labor is free. You know, it seems to me it's still the case that they are spending a lot of time doing things they wouldn't do except for the very large wage that they're able to command for it. All right. But let's suppose that they have chosen to do that. Then the question becomes, well, why have they chosen to do that? And was that choice a genuinely free choice? And here we get into an aspect of, some of this is there in Marx, but it's much more prominent in the later Frankfurt School in the 20th century, right? Which is that people make choices that are obviously deeply influenced by the values, norms, culture in the world that they find around them, right? And it is, of course, possible that the surrounding, ideological environment, broadly speaking, right, distorts their choices in ways that they wouldn't make those choices in the absence of that ideological background. Right? And we can all think of easy cases, of that. The Cultural Revolution in Mao's China in 1965, right? That was clearly an ideological fervor that led a lot of people to make choices, many of which they came to regret after the fact. The question then becomes how pervasive that kind of phenomenon is, right? And how many of the cases that you're referring to, fit that. Let me just tell you an anecdote, and like all anecdotes, it illustrates something, but it may not prove a lot. Okay. I had a former student whose father was an extremely successful lawyer, and I won't go into any the details. He was a named partner of his firm, that kind of thing. Eventually retired, and what the student told me is that, and he's living very well in retirement. He made a lot of money. But what the student told me, which was really kind of sad, is that the father thought, on reflecting on his career, that he'd wasted his life. And how often does that happen, right? It's a Citizen Kane phenomenon, right? At the end, you kind of get the feeling he realizes that, right? He thinks back to the sled and the innocence of childhood when, of course, when you go sledding as a child, that's paradigmatic spontaneous activity. You do it because you want to do it and for no other reason, right? How common is that? I don't know the answer to that. Right? But I think that is a real phenomenon too, just as it's a real phenomenon that some people choose the more lucrative profession rather than the one that they would most want to spend their time on.
So a couple of thoughts. The one you might think of is that capitalism is a driver of prosperity and puts people in a situation where they're able to elect to sacrifice some of their time and their energies in exchange for wealth, which buys them a lot of freedom. And so, if we look at how poverty has diminished over the last 200 years, it's dramatic. Very few people are in the same situation that they would have been in Marx's time of, really, if I don't do this work, I will die or my children will die. That high level of coercion. What you have here is there's going to be drudgery, and in exchange for the drudgery, you'll get a lot of money, but you'll get some time where you'll be able to spend that money and do what you like. And that's capitalism is going to generate you much more of that kind of system than any other system. There's something else, though, which is very interesting to me, which is Marx's accounts of what a good life would be. So you mentioned this idea of someone looking back on their life and thinking that they wasted it. On Marx's view, what would be a life well spent?
Um, I want to resist the statement that there are very few people in the situation of the paradigmatic wage slave who have to choose between doing this awful work and surviving. I think it's a complicated empirical question, right? There are fewer in the advanced capitalist societies now than there were in the mid-19th century. That's absolutely true. It's a big world. There's still a lot of wage slavery out there, okay? And I don't think you want to, there's no reason for you to dispute that. Second thing, right? Capitalism is a driver of prosperity. This is where Marx and Milton Friedman are in very strong agreement. It's why this whole literature, which is kind of big in philosophy, is, what's morally wrong with capitalism, is a totally un-Marxian question. It's just never a question he asks, right? Capitalism is the best economic system in the history of humankind for maximizing the development of technology and productive power. Has no competitors, right? And it's because of what I've been referring to as the logic of how capitalism works, right? Which is that every capitalist is incentivized for technological progress at the cost of being destroyed in the marketplace, right? This is how it works, right? So of course, Marx says capitalism produces more wealth than any other system in the economic system in the history of the world. One possibility is we are in a kind of sweet spot for capitalism, as it were, at least in the relatively wealthy capitalist countries, okay? In the sense that capitalism has produced a lot of technological development that enables a great deal of prosperity, right? And it allows a lot of people, but not all, the trade-off you describe, which is perhaps doing work they'd rather not do, so they are unfree, but then they get the benefits of free time with resources to do the things that they actually want to do. Okay? And it would make it less likely that there would ever be a revolutionary situation if that were the status quo in perpetuity. And the problem is Marx doesn't think that's the case. And I feel I should say something about it because this question of the logic of capitalism has come up twice now, and it's directly relevant, Mark, to what you're talking about, which is, so in the capitalist marketplace, right, capitalists have only one raison d'etre, which is to make profit, okay? Back in 1970, Milton Friedman famously said, corporations don't have social responsibilities. The only responsibility of the corporation is to make profit. And the whole capitalist media arose in an ideological uproar, said, no, corporations have social responsibility, blah, blah, blah. And so the thing is, Marx would have totally agreed with Milton Friedman, right? Corporations have only one thing they can do, which is make a profit. Because if they don't, another corporation will make the profit and drive them out of the marketplace. It's that simple. If there's money to be made on, say, environmental and social concerns, right, then corporations can do that. But in a capitalist marketplace, they can't get too carried away with that, right? Because if I'm the kind-hearted capitalist, I'm sure I would because I'm a softie. But if I were the kind-hearted capitalist, I say, you know what? I'm going to return more of the profit margin here to my workers. Okay. And you know what? I'm not going to invest in this technology that's going to displace, a quarter of my workforce. I owe something to these people. I owe them a job. Okay. So I'm the kind-hearted capitalist. And then Jason comes along. I can see he's not going to be the kind-hearted capitalist. Jason comes along. He runs a factory in producing the same stuff. And he hears about this sucker, Brian, right, who's so sympathetic to his workers. And Jason says, screw that. He invests in the technology, reduces his cost, increases his profit margin, and the next thing you know, Brian's out of business. Okay? And that's how capitalism works. This is why it's so good at generating technological progress. Because any capitalist who doesn't avail themselves of technology that will reduce their costs is going to have less profit than the capitalists who do. Okay? And so it's the internal logic of capitalism. Reduce your costs to increase your profits. Okay? And the question is, where does that lead in the end? That's, as it were, the big question for Marx. Right? Artificial intelligence is going to put this on the table in a way that earlier technological advances haven't, in part because artificial intelligence is going to affect a different class of workers, people like you and me, Mark, and you too, Jason. I'm not sure what your day job is. I know Mark's day job is a lawyer. And one of my colleagues like to say is artificial intelligence is going to destroy our business model in the law school, right? It is already having some effects. Okay, that is, artificial intelligence can do reasonably well certain tasks that junior lawyers at big firms perform. Okay? And that's just going to accelerate as these large language models get better and better, which it seems they're likely to do. Okay? And now, what's the situation of businesses, right? The business can say, oh, this would be a disaster for our workers, so we're not going to invest in artificial intelligence. They'll go out of business because some of their competitors will. Right? Apparently, there's been a huge decline in demand for new MBAs, masters, business degrees in the United States. Part of the reason, apparently, I've told this by colleagues, is that all the big consulting firms, they're global consulting firms, they're slowing down their hiring because they're trying to figure out how much AI can do. Okay? Now, this is going to be MBAs who are going to be unemployed, just like it's going to be people with law degrees who are going to be unemployed or underemployed. Okay? If Marx is right about the logic of the way this works, right, at some point, right, at the end point here, we're not going to be needed. Right? And, most of us survive by getting a wage for what we do, right? I get a pretty good wage. I got no complaints about it, okay? But if there's no need for what I do, if there's no need for lawyers, and it's not there yet. You go to court a lot. As I said to one of my kids who was thinking about law school, lawyers who go to court are going to be less affected by this, or it's going to be a lot further off, right? So at the end of the day, right, we're all going to be in the situation of the paradigmatic wage slave. That's Marx's prediction, right? I mean, to put it very, very simple, okay? But it's not there yet. It's not there yet, and Marx was totally wrong that it was going to occur in the 19th century. Marx he would have hated us saying this, right? But he was a utopian in this regard, like a lot of people in the 19th century, because the Industrial Revolution, 1750 to 1850, represented an increase in productive power greater than everything in human history up until that time. So there were lots of utopians like, wow, man is going to be falling from heaven any minute now. Add to that, he didn't have access to the internet, so he didn't really know what was going on in Africa or Asia or other parts of the world. Only now are we getting closer to genuinely global capitalism, right? Which Marx himself thought was essential. Okay. So Marx had a certain view about human nature, right? He had a very definite view about what humans were essentially like. Right? As you may know, Marx actually studied philosophy and wrote a PhD dissertation in philosophy. And he'd studied Aristotle, and he was taken with the loosely speaking Aristotelian idea that there's something human beings are essentially like, and that a good or flourishing life for them is one in which they utilize these distinctive capacities, right? They realize them fully. Okay? And what Marx calls alienation, famously in his 1844 manuscripts, very early writing he did on this subject, is basically being alienated from your essential nature, being unable to do what you essentially are. Okay? Now, of course, for Aristotle, our essential nature had to do with rationality and reason. That was not Marx's view. And Marx didn't deny we were rational animals. Marx thought the essential characteristic of human beings is that they want to engage in productive activity. Okay? but not simply to meet their material needs. Right? And the example he likes to give is human beings will invest time and effort to produce things simply because they're beautiful. And, the anthropological record reveals that even under the most difficult material circumstances, people, in fact, devoted time to producing things that were beautiful, right? Think of the famous cave paintings in France, from thousands of years ago. But there's lots of examples of this, right? Um, as I like to say, when you send little kids to school, they go to kindergarten, as we call it here, right? And first grade, and they always have opportunities for the kids to do art. And the thing is, you don't have to ride them too hard on that one, right? Maybe to learn their math, yes, but if you give them, some clay, a canvas, paint, they go right at it, right? And I think this is roughly what Marx is thinking of, is that human beings by their nature don't want to be couch potatoes, right? It may be that people who are beaten down by drudgery want to be couch potatoes on the weekend, but human beings, a genuinely free situation, right, would want to make things and do things, but not simply to survive, right? But for other reasons, including aesthetic reason. Um, and I give the art examples just one. I don't mean to suggest that that's exhaustive. I think there's lots of spontaneous labor that people engage in. As I said, you guys doing this show is spontaneous labor in Marx's sense. Right? I don't know if this episode is aesthetically pleasing, right? But it's intellectually pleasing, I hope, right? The show in general is intellectually stimulating, right? People watch it not because they're paid to watch it, but because it's fun. It makes them think. Those are things they want to do. So there's lots of productive activity that people would engage in. And there's also manual productive labor that people would, engage in. Some people like to make things, right? We all know this. I have a colleague elsewhere. He loves to make um, really beautiful book bindings for old books. It's a kind of interesting hobby, right? But this is what he spends a lot of his free time doing. Anyway, there's many different possibilities here. So it's not like Marx thinks there's a set list. What he does think is that if people are free, that is, they don't need to work or produce simply to survive, they will want to engage in productive activity of different kinds. And that would be the essence of that would be the essential fact about a good life for human beings. There's other stuff we could add to it from Marx's early writings. I'll just say that my view is that Marx left behind a lot of the ideas from the early writings, that he moved on to trying to develop a descriptive explanatory theory that made sense of the world he saw developing around him. But one thing he did keep was this basic idea that human beings essentially want to engage in free productive activity, including to produce things for aesthetic or intellectual reasons, right? For the intellectual or aesthetic satisfaction. And that most people are unable to do so under contemporary conditions because they are essentially unfree.
So, an objection to the good life, well, not an objection to the good life, but at least Marx's conception of it. Um, it seems like just because you are capable of doing something and you want to do it doesn't necessarily mean it's good, both for you or in general. So, let's look at Dexter, the serial killer from TV. Really good at killing, just really good at it, loves it. Just it's a delicious joy for him. It seems like when he does so, that's not living a good life and it's not good in general. And that just seems like a clear counterexample, at least to the claim that fulfilling your capacities is sufficient for the good life.
Okay. So a couple of things. I'm not familiar with Dexter, so I will just take the bare facts as you have given them to me. It is possible that Dexter's life is very good for him. I can see it's certainly bad for lots of other people. No question about that. I'm not sure Marx is even committed to saying that it is good for him. Marx's view, and again, this reflects the Aristotelian influence, right? His view of the goodness of a life is broadly speaking, an objectivist view. It is a view that does not depend on the subjective states of people, of what they desire or what they would desire under ideal conditions. Okay. And the core idea for Marx is the Aristotelian idea, and Aristotle's view is an objectivist view as well, right? When Aristotle tells us that the best life for a human being is to be a philosopher, right? And I tell that to some of my kids, and they like roll their eyes. That's neither here nor there for Aristotle, right? So I agree, none of it necessarily follows. The objectivist assumptions that Marx is working with are certainly debatable, including his conception of what human beings are essentially like. As I tried to suggest, I think there's plausible to his thought about this. The real question about your Dexter person is whether Dexter's desire for serial murder, right, is really who he essentially is, or a consequence of deformities or pathologies or circumstances or what have you, right? And this is where we'd actually have to know a lot more about Dexter. It's pretty clear that Marx didn't think as a paradigm of a good life. He didn't have in mind mass murderers of either the Dexter variety or the Stalin variety.
But then it's not your capacities that matter, right? Or at least not your surface capacities. It's your capacities in an Aristotelian sense, your telos, your ultimate goal as a human being that seems to matter.
It's your essential nature that matters, right? And it may be that you are alienated from your essential nature, with the result you end up as a mass murderer, right? I mean, just to run with the particular example that you're using. Marx thinks, again, what does he think? The thing about mass murder is it doesn't even seem to fit Marx's basic claim, which is that human beings essentially want to produce things. They want to produce things not simply to meet their material needs, but simply for the sake of production. He thinks that we are productive creatures by nature. That's the crucial claim.
I guess the problem then is if you're going to cash out your capacities or your essential nature in this incredibly abstract sense. So if you're denying that that's what Dexter's essential nature is, that some pathology causing that, and his deep internal core self, that's not really what his essential nature is, then it sounds like all human beings are going to have the same essential nature. It's going to be cashed out in some very abstract sense. And if everyone were to do the same things, they would all be behaving in free ways that are entirely useless for society because they'd all be producing the same thing.
Okay, so slow down there, because you're running a couple of things together, right? It's certainly the case that if an attribute is essential to human nature, then all human beings have it. That does follow. So I'm with you that far, okay? If the essential nature of human beings is to want to engage in productive activity unrelated to meeting material needs, it doesn't follow that they would all engage in the same productive activity. There might be quite a lot of variation in that regard. Third thing to bear in mind, this is very important, right? This goes back to capitalism produces prosperity, right? Marx thinks capitalism is essential for people to be genuinely free because he thinks it's only possible under conditions of massive productive power, right? Which is why there never should have been communism in Russia in 1917 or China in 1948 or Cuba Castro was just kind of an accidental Marxist because the Soviets were going to pay the bills. He was not really an ideological Marxist. Lenin was a little more aware of this problem. Mao, I think, was completely unaware of it. None of those societies had the level of productive development that Marx thought was essential, and he says as much, essential for free labor to be possible. Because, and this goes back to something you said, Jason, it is possible that even if people engaging in free productive activity aren't all producing the same thing, they may not be producing things that meet human needs, and human needs still have to be met, right? And that's why massive productive power is a necessary precondition for an alternative to capitalism. But at the same time, only capitalism is capable of producing massive productive power, right? That's in a kind of crude nutshell, that is Marx's view, which is why talking about what's wrong with capitalism is neither here nor there. Capitalism is essential, right? Capitalism is absolutely essential for a better future, better in which people can labor freely, in which they can lead good lives, in that sense and so on.
So on this front, can you tell us the difference between, let's say, Marx's ideal utopia, which requires capitalism to get to a certain state, versus how it's been tried in places that weren't transitioning from a capitalist economy?
Marx in the 19th century thought that Germany, maybe England, and the US were the best candidates for communism. You know? Marx also thought, completely incorrectly, that the productive power that had increased so much in 100 years was getting very close to, manna from heaven. Right? He thought that was happening. He wasn't the only one in the 19th century who had that kind of utopian thought based on how impressive the Industrial Revolution was. Um, Marx corresponded late in his life with some of the Russian revolutionaries when he discovered they were actually reading Capital. Okay. Joseph Stalin, right, who was a gangster, basically. Right? He was the muscle for the Bolsheviks. But he was reading Capital, okay? And so Marx, wrote them encouraging letters and so on. But it's absolutely clear from everything Marx wrote that you could not have communism in a society that was basically an agricultural society as Russia was in 1917. And the same thing for China in 1948. Okay? So if they had been doctrinaire Marxists, what would they have done in 1917? They still would have executed the Tsar. He was a bad guy. But putting that aside, right, they would have instituted capitalist relations of production. They would have instituted capitalism. They would have made some efforts, to ensure redistribution, right, for the peasants and so on who had been very badly off under the essentially feudal system in Russia, right? As you may know, Russia, only freed its serfs in the late 19th century, right? Later than anywhere else in Europe. So Russia was extremely primitive, right? Extremely primitive. So if they'd been doctrinaire Marxists, they would have instituted capitalism. That is not what they did. Right? They did it very actually briefly in Russia while they were fighting the Civil War, but that ended very quickly. And then, of course, Lenin, who was sort of aware of this issue in Marxist theory, died, and Stalin, who was a sociopath and a paranoid homicidal maniac, took over, and that was the end of that. So they were the wrong places for what Marx was calling communism. I mean, I should say, look, it's the year 2025. Communism is a damaged brand, to talk the language of capitalist advertising people. We need a new word for it, right? Because it's become hopelessly associated with regimes that Marx himself clearly would have loathed. It's often not remembered, but Marx was a big fan of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and of the American Bill of Rights. He didn't think this was full human liberation, but he thought it was very clear progress. That it was very clear progress over what came before. Now, on the question, well, what does a proper communist society look like according to Marx? Marx famously tells us almost nothing. He tells us almost nothing about it. There are certain slogans that people from the state withers away, but that doesn't actually mean the state withers away, right? He thought there were certain state functions that were devoted to propping up capitalism that wither away. But what's absolutely essential for communism, as he thinks about it, is a great deal of administrative functioning, right? That is, even if you have massive productive power, right, things still have to be distributed to the people who need them, for example. And you still need to know which day to take out the recycles, right? I mean, there's all kinds of mundane stuff that require law and administration, even in that kind of society. But Marx says very, very little about this. I think partly he felt, probably correctly, he was ill-equipped to say much about it, a society that doesn't yet exist, right? Famously or infamously, one of his contemporaries and often a critic thought that Marx was being very naive, right? And that he thought that people in charge of administering massive productive power for the benefit of human society as a whole wouldn't do that, right? That they would behave more like the Politburo behaved, right? And they would constitute a different class with a different set of interests at the disadvantage of everyone else. Obviously, that looks very prescient given the experience in, for example, in the Soviet Union. Marx doesn't think much about this. Marx, as I say, he has a conception of human nature, but it doesn't lay much emphasis on attractive features of human nature, right? This was one of Marx's very big differences from Freud. Is Freud thinks, and Nietzsche thinks this too, that it is also a fact about human nature that human beings take a great deal of pleasure and satisfaction in cruelty and aggression. Okay, and there's nothing in Marx, any sign that he thinks anything like that is true. On that issue, I'm closer to Nietzsche and Freud, and therefore I think you have to think very hard about these questions about, if you had the benefit of massive productive power, how would you need to organize a society such that the less attractive features of human nature didn't, as it were, destroy everything and everyone? Right.
So I wonder, would Marx be more fond of the anarcho-capitalist or the anarcho-communist? So the anarcho-capitalist says, look, what's really good at distributing resources are markets. People freely exchange with each other. You're much more likely to have all the stuff that you want in a society where you're able to freely exchange with people than in this highly sort of regulated Soviet-style society. If the state is to wither, that's the good thing. Like, don't let the state do any of the kind of divvying up of resources, because people are avaricious and they'll divvy up for themselves, and they'll hold it as the vanguard on behalf of the people, but the people will get screwed. Whereas if you have a whole range of private actors that sort of freely trade with each other, and you produce enough stuff, then the wealthy people will be able to do all the free wonderful things that they want. You might think, for example, that those that are living in the utopia are the tech billionaires who don't need the money but are kind of intrigued by innovation and do all sorts of things because it's valuable in and of itself, or they want to further the cause of humanity, ship people off to Mars, whatever it is. And
now you have done legal work for Elon Musk. I think you require a disclosure at this moment. Elon Musk is not Marx's ideal. But I understand where you're going with this. I mean, I think that the problem with what you're calling anarcho-capitalism is it's utopian in a very different way. It's utopian in thinking that very powerful and wealthy capitalists, I mean, there's a guy from South Africa, I'll think of the name again, who might fit the bill, will in fact accumulate vast amounts of wealth, right? And do basically what states do, right? Because they become so powerful and wealthy, right? They'll be bad actors in all kinds of ways. That's one kind of utopianism. Is why wouldn't that happen, right? And it does seem to happen in many cases. But the other bit of utopianism is it doesn't deal with the logic of how capitalism works, which is that the successful anarcho-capitalists are not going to need most of humanity at a certain point, because they will have mastered, created, owned so much technology that they have everything they want. This is why we use this image in the book based on this terrible sci-fi movie, The Elysium. Have you seen The Elysium? Science fiction movie, right, in which everyone on Earth is immiserated, and the wealthy elite live in a paradise that orbits around the Earth and is completely protected from the miserable people. Okay, on Marx's understanding of how capitalism works, that's as likely to be the outcome, right, as the utopian anarcho-capitalist scenario. In fact, it's much more likely than the anarcho-capitalism scenario. So, now the Elysium, of course, has silly plot developments that are irrelevant for this purpose, like the hero manages to get in to the utopia floating around and, blow it up and so on. That's not part of Marx's story, right? But this is one of the reasons we say in the book that, Marx held on to a kind of optimism about how history and capitalism was necessarily going to unfold, right? And he thought it would necessarily end in communist revolution, which was going to be a good thing. But even on the terms of his own argument, there's no reason to think that. It's just as likely to be, as Rosa Luxemburg put it, barbarism, right? Where those who control technology and power, and presumably also military resources and so on, keep it all for themselves and consign the rest of the people to, misery on earth, as in the Elysium film. Right. So there's a lot of utopias floating around. And as I say, Marx was guilty of some utopian thinking, and the anarcho-capitalists are certainly guilty of a different kind of utopian thinking.
So, a few objections as the resident anarcho-capitalist. So, one of them is maybe a problem with this account of the logic of capitalism is that it doesn't account for shifting desires. So, yes, it is true that capitalism's goal is to become more and more efficient at fulfilling our desires. But the assumption is that once those desires are satisfied, there aren't new ones to take their place. And so people are just walking around aimlessly unuseful. But
Okay.
of course, that's not historically what happens. Once a desire is satisfied, we realize that that desire is able to springboard us to more sophisticated, higher order desires. So, for example, we wanted to find a way to print books without manually pressing ink onto paper. Wow, we've invented the printing press. Amazing. Do all the people involved in publishing now go home and never get involved in publishing anything further? No, not of course not. What they do is they set on the path to creating more and more sophisticated forms of reading. And now there's an ebook industry, there's an audiobook industry, there's much larger industries than in the first place. So desires shift, and so the roles that people can play and the work that people can do to meet those desires shift with them.
Okay, so I think there's two different thoughts there that aren't necessarily related. One is about desire shifting, which I think is certainly true, and the other is about what the labor economists call, replacement effects of technological innovation, right? Um, so I'll give a different example of this, but your printed books and ebooks is a version of this. Along comes the automobile, and all the blacksmiths are out of business because the horses don't need horseshoes, right? Well, they can go work in the auto factories. That's a replacement effect. There's new productive activity for them to engage in. And and for about 175 years now, we've seen pretty consistent replacement effects, right? The question is, and I've never been able to get a straight answer on this from any defender of capitalism, because I don't think they have an answer, is why should we think that's always going to be the case going into the future, right? Why should we always expect a replacement effect? And now here's the thing that should be a little alarming, and we discussed this in the book, which is that neoclassical labor economists have noticed a somewhat concerning pattern in the 21st century in countries like the United States, but also other wealthy capitalist countries, which is that there's less replacement effect. Human labor is being displaced by technology, but there aren't as many replacement effects elsewhere in the economy. And now you add artificial intelligence to that mix, and the replacement effects are going to start to be very, very, very significant. That's the worry. That's the essence of the the Marxian critique here. And you know, the fact that there's lots of perils of induction, as David Hume taught us, but you don't have to be as extreme as Hume to still realize an induction over 175 years of capitalism may not be that reassuring about the next 100 or the next 200 years, right? Especially as the pace of technological innovation ratchets up in various ways that seem to affect human labor. Now, certainly the people's desires shift, but understand the question for Marx, given what I just said, is that human beings may have all kinds of new desires, but if they don't have their basic material needs met, right? There are certain basic needs human beings have that are not, as it were, hostage to desire, right? You know, whether you prefer Taylor Swift or Black Sabbath, that may be hostage to desire. And having listened to Taylor Swift, I have to say, anyone who has that desire, it's pathological. But that's a separate debate. Um, I'm kidding about that. Apologies to the Taylor Swift fans. Um, but so put aside the kind of desires that shift quite a lot, right? Um, all human beings, in virtue of their biological and psychological nature, have certain basic needs, right? Food, clothing, shelter, some degree of sociability, and opportunities for interaction with other human beings and things like that. Right? Um, Marx's worry, right, is that if the planet Earth comes to resemble the planet Earth in Elysium, we've got a problem meeting even the basic needs. It doesn't matter what other desires people have. They are genuinely immiserated in the absolute sense. Right? Marx used two different senses of immiseration. Absolute was the people on the Elysian planet with like nothing, barely getting by, if at all, right? And then relative immiseration, was, you don't have very much, but then some people have a huge amount, much more than they could possibly need. That would be relative immiseration. We have degrees of relative immiseration in many human societies right now. But I think it's Marx's diagnosis of capitalism is that it's going to press us towards a situation of absolute immiseration. Some Marxist theorists deny this. I'll be honest, I don't engage. We engage with a lot of other Marxist theorists in the book. Marx's theory has been badly served by the 20th century. And I don't mean in this case Stalin and Mao. I mean, I think a lot of Western Marxism was quite mistaken about what Marx was up to. But it's also too many people who get interested in Marx take what I would call a religious interest in Marx. And that's never healthy with any thinker, right? Marx can't be wrong. The question is, if we just parse the text of Capital Volume 3 a little more carefully, we'll get at the truth. I'm not really interested particularly in that. I think Marx is a genius, and I think he was obviously wrong about certain things, right? You can't get at things that are interesting and still worth thinking about unless you also can clear away the stuff that is obviously wrong. So Marx was working on 3 volumes. He only actually published 1. The other 2 angles sort of pieced together. There's a lot of interesting stuff there. There's a lot of stuff that's not so successful. And that's okay. You can still be a genius and screw up. I think that's a good principle in general in life.
So one of the things that you're quite critical about is Marx's adoption of labor theory of value. So can you sort of just give us an account of how the theory works, how it contrasts with, theories produced by Minga around, let's say desire satisfaction, and whether Marx's adoption of that theory ruins his critique of capitalism, whether you can escape it?
The short answer is, if you think that the labor theory of value is supposed to explain prices, or what Marx calls production prices, and I'll explain that in a second, it fails. The theory fails, and it's a waste of time trying to salvage it. And many Marxist economists actually by now fully agree with that. The failure of the labor theory of value doesn't affect very much of Marx's critique of capitalism. It does affect a few things that go out the window. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter that much. And in particular, it doesn't matter because the basic claim about the logic of capitalism and the crises of overproduction and underconsumption, as Marx calls it, right, is unaffected by the labor theory of value entirely. Okay. Now, what was the classical economic tradition which Marx was growing out of, right? So he's read Adam Smith, and he's read in particular the British economist David Ricardo, had a very big impact on them. And he has a very high opinion of both Smith and Ricardo, right? And you find the first suggestions of a labor theory of value actually in Adam Smith, right? And the basic idea is, look, here's a phenomenon. Things cost different amounts of money. Why? Okay. Here's a hypothesis. Things cost different amounts of money because different amounts of labor goes into producing them, right? So that the amount of labor has something to do with the price of goods. Right? Smith doesn't ultimately sign on to this as a general theory of price, but he does suggest it, right? He says, if you've got deer hunters and beaver hunters out there, right? And it takes twice as long to hunt a deer, catch a deer as to catch a beaver, then the price of deer should be twice that of beavers. Okay. And if it's not, then the deer hunters will just switch to hunting, catching beavers because that's more profitable, right? If they really can't get twice the amount, why would they do it? And that's in a nutshell, that's the basic idea. Now, Marx, partly following Ricardo, but also modifying him, adds various modifications of this, right? One thing Ricardo observes is in thinking about the relative price of deers and beavers, you also have to take account of the tools that deer hunters and beaver hunters utilize, right? That is, labor went into producing the cages that capture, right, the beavers. And labor went into producing the bows and arrows used for hunting the deers, okay? So that's somehow got to be factored into the equation. And then Marx, notices, look, people work more and less efficiently, right? I mean, if I'm charged with catching beavers, it's going to take a very, very, very long time because I'm inept, okay? That can't be the gauge of the price. It's got to be what Marx calls the socially necessary labor time, right? Something like the average competence and skill level is what is going to determine the price. And Marx then spends a great deal of volume 3 of Capital trying to use this modified version of Ricardo's labor theory of value to explain what he calls the production price, which would be the price of a commodity plus some assumption about the rate of profit that the capitalist was trying to make, right? But most of the price is explained by all these complicated labor inputs, right? So we've got not just the workers in the factory and their socially necessary labor time, but all the work that went into producing the factory itself and all the work that went into collecting and transporting the raw materials and so on and so forth. It gets very, very, very complicated. And Marx spent a lot of time working on this, and he wasn't successful at doing it. And I think what Paul Sweezy, who was probably the most important Marxist economist of the 20th century, says about this is basically right, which is you want to understand the price of commodities in the marketplace, you're much better off in neoclassical marginalist theory, right? Which says, why do things cost what they cost? Has to do with whether consumers want them and how much they want them, okay? And that'll get you prices in the marketplace. So that aspect of the labor theory of value fails. I said earlier, there are people who parse capital as though it's the Talmud, and they think they've got an alternative view. The most sophisticated of them is this guy, Michael Heinrich. But I don't ultimately find him convincing. But they think labor theory of value is not really meant to explain anything about prices, which means that all of that huge part of volume 3 of Capital was Marx just confused about what he was doing. And so I don't buy it. I think he knew exactly what he was doing. He knew what the problem was that Ricardo had set him, and he was not successful in solving it. Okay. So there are people who try to salvage it as something other than a theory of price. I don't actually think that's correct. Now, what do you lose from that? You lose a certain technical explanation of the notion of exploitation, right? But you still have, perfectly ordinary colloquial senses of exploitation, right? I mean, capitalists only employ workers because they contribute to profit. And it's very clear that the profits a capitalist firm generates, only a portion of it goes in wages to the people who work there, right? And, as Sweezy said, right, I mean, exploitation is basically it's a technical idea, which is society produces a certain amount of wealth, right? And there's a surplus that is beyond what's necessary to meet people's basic needs. And the question is, who gets the surplus, right? And it turns out Elon Musk gets more of the surplus than even you, his lawyer, let alone me, right? Sorry, I don't mean to be picking you on here, Mark. I'm just having fun with this. But that's the reality, right? None of Elon Musk's lawyers get as much of the surplus as Elon Musk gets. Okay. So you can have less technical notions of surplus and exploitation and so on. The technical notion of the fetishism of commodities does depend on the labor theory of values. The idea of fetishism of commodities is based on the idea of fetishism, which was a notion introduced by Feuerbach. And the idea of a fetishism, and it survives in the colloquial usage of like a foot fetishist. I'll make the connection in a second. But the idea of fetishism is you invest in something, powers it doesn't have, and then those powers kind of lord over you, and you don't recognize that it's entirely you, right? So the foot fetishist thinks that the foot is full of these powers of sexual arousal and attraction, but it's not in the foot, right? Foot's just the foot. It's all in the perception of the foot fetishist. Feuerbach's example was God, right? God is invested with all these powers by human beings, and then human beings think God sits on judgment of them, is going to dole out rewards and punishments. It's all a fetishism, right? In the case of commodities, right, the thought was that in the marketplace, people confront commodities as though they have an inherent value without recognizing that whatever value they have was created by the socially necessary labor time to create that value. Okay? But if socially necessary labor time doesn't explain the value of things in the marketplace, then that explanation doesn't work. Okay. Now, again, there's a more ordinary sense of fetishism of commodities which survives even if you reject the labor theory of value, which is the idea we're all familiar with, which is that commodities in the marketplace, they do tend, some of them acquire sort of funny powers. Oh, he's got a Rolex. Wow. Must be a very important person, right? That's so beautiful. I wish I could have one of those. But that's not quite the technical notion of fetishism, right? That's just the sense of, getting over invested in commodities, right? And thinking things are more than they really are. And anybody can acknowledge, right, that may not be a healthy way to relate to, to the stuff that's out there in the world. So you lose some things, but I think the main claims Marx is interested in about the logic of how capitalism operates are independent of the labor theory of value, and his reasons for thinking that capitalism is going to move towards increasing immiseration of people because capitalists will need less and less human labor power, which is all most of us have to sell. That analysis stands or falls independently of the labor theory of value.
I mean, basically, my view is that you just have a bad account of human nature. So it's like you are predicting humans will behave in certain ways that they just don't. So a good example is shifting desires, and you say, well, hold on, the burden of proof is for you to show why desires won't shift in such a way and work replacement won't happen in such a way in future that it always has in the past. In other words, we need more than induction. But I wonder whether that's where the burden of proof lies. It's, we've got this long account of human behavior in capitalist societies, and you're saying, well, next time it's just going to be different.
But I need to know which desire you think is going to shift that's going to prevent this. Because the basic desire every capitalist has to have to survive as a capitalist is the desire to maximize profit. If they don't have that, the marketplace destroys them. That's how capitalism works. This is Milton Friedman. This is how it works, right? And therefore, what desire on the part of capitalists is going to change such that they're going to find new forms of labor for the vast majority of human beings who have only their labor power to sell, right? Why should we think that's going to happen? Let's assume we have massive productive power. It's owned by a small number of capitalists, okay? Or 10,000 capitalists or whatever, right? And maybe they'll realize, aha, Marx was onto something. We need some consumers out there, and they can't be consumers unless they've got some income. So we will agree to a massive scheme of redistribution, universal basic income. I actually think that's why universal basic income has become popular, is because certain elites recognize that this problem is starting to loom. And it's possible. There's nothing in the theory that rules it out. I think the Elysium scenario is much more likely. Because capitalism does encourage a certain desire on the part of capitalists that is incompatible with the kind of altruism that would have to motivate the move you're describing.
But that's just such a bad empirical understanding of what's happening in capitalist societies. I think you're misunderstanding the status of societies in capitalist states. So if you have a look at capitalist states, it's true that the top become wealthier, but it's not true that the bottom become poorer. So people at the bottom of the ladder in capitalist societies increase their wealth on average. They don't decrease in free market capitalist societies.
Again, you're just doing an induction over 175 years, and you're completely ignoring Marx's claim about the logic of how capitalism operates, right? Nobody disputes what you just said, though I will point out that in the most developed capitalist societies, the trend is now moving the other way, namely the United States, okay? That is, it's very important not to be misled. The question is, what can we inductively infer from what's happened between 1850 and 2025? Marx doesn't deny that capitalism produces vast amounts of wealth and technological innovation. That's central to his entire view. The question is, where is this going to go, given the logic of how capitalist markets operate? That's the only question. And it seems to me you, as an anarcho-capitalist, have to assume something which is very unrealistic, which is that capitalists will all of a sudden become very other-regarding and altruistic, whereas Marx assumes they're selfish, just like he assumes the working class is selfish. There's no appeal in Marx to altruism or doing what's morally right. His claim is that it is in the self-interest of an entire class of people at some point in time to transform the productive activity of society. Right? This is the thing I like about Marx. There's no moralism. There's no, you ought to think about other people and be more concerned about them. Right? And I think he's got capitalists right. And I think you are a utopian if you think that the capitalist class, confronted with the choice between the mass immiseration of people 100 or 200 years from now, and just walling them off, right, is going to go in the altruistic direction. I don't see it, but I'm a cynic about human nature, not like you.
I mean, if I understand your claim, it's really a descriptive one, which is to say, at some point the capitalist runs out of customers, which means that the system implodes, and so you wind up with a terrible state of affairs. I mean, Jason is a utopian. I think the idea is that the anarcho-capitalism sort of leads to everyone being very prosperous.
Right, and that's based on a misunderstanding of capitalism. It's based on not thinking clearly about how capitalism actually works.
What you might think is that capitalists respond to incentives as they shift. So like one of the reasons why a capitalist might want to pay their staff more is that if you're at Google, for example, and you say, well, there's a set of people who have a very rare talent, which is to program at this very high level. If I give them all these wonderful luxuries, they're going to work for me instead of my competitor. I mean, you've got examples of guys being paid like hundreds of millions of dollars in AI to say, like, swap over to me because I think you're worth it. The kind of goods that you can do. So the capitalist has an incentive to treat their labor well because of the profit motive.
This just goes back to horseshoes and working in the auto factory. Obviously, some of this has been happening. But let me point out a little bit of reality to you, which is important here, which is in Silicon Valley for years, they had massive price fixing of labor costs. They had agreements among the major firms not to raid the talent. Why? Because they're run by capitalists. Because they could see that they might end up having to endlessly ratchet up the compensation. Okay. And allegedly that has ended, remains to be seen. But, your brilliant Google engineer at some point is going to get eaten by the AI he developed. And then the AI will develop the next innovation, and the Google engineer will be reduced to doing podcasts or teaching philosophy. I mean, that could sink really low.
So maybe one problem with your view is that you're viewing technological progress as a resource that can be hoarded. So you're seeing, for example, the development of AI or ChatGPT as something that the wealthy will possess, and not the poor. But we're not seeing that. So ChatGPT is freely available, and it's now becoming adopted at grassroots level. So part of the problem is that you're not accounting for technological bleed between the supposed elite and the poor.
Good. Okay, so if there were a massive amount of technological bleed, that would indeed change the forecast. I agree with that. I think that's right. The question is whether we should think that's going to happen. Your ChatGPT example is interesting because the best forms of ChatGPT you have to pay for. The ones that are free are, pretty good and have gotten better, over the course of just a year and a half or so. Right? But they still fail my jurisprudence exams. But I am told that the better ones that you pay for, they can do a little bit better on a lot of these things. So yes, there's going to be some technological bleed, but it's going to stop. Right? It's going to be like Uber. Right? Uber was ridiculously cheap until they crushed the taxi cabs, and now Uber's, at least where I am, I don't know if it's different where you are, it's basically no different in terms of the cost. The cost has gone way up for those things. So we're familiar with the pattern, right? That capitalists, and especially capitalists, trying to break into markets, right, have reasons to let the technology bleed, but then they also tend to put limits on the bleeding at a certain point. Here's a scenario, right? Marx's view was that the state manages the collective affairs of the bourgeoisie, the ruling class. Well, if the state is really doing its job, okay, then it will be able to diagnose the problem that's coming down the line, namely the elimination of the need for wage labor, mass immiseration, absence of consumers for products, and will intervene, right? Either through redistributive taxation, universal basic income, technology bleeding, and so on, in order to solve the problem. we discussed this briefly in the book. Certainly a possibility. Nothing in Marx's theory rules that out. But this all goes back to the fact that, the sort of the happy teleology, right? This is going to all end in a good place, is not actually warranted by the terms of Marx's own analysis. And he was wrong to take over this view of history from Hegel, right? Because Hegel had one big advantage: he believed in God. When you have a supernatural being, you can be a little more optimistic about happy endings. Marx doesn't have that, since he's an atheist thinker.
Well, Brian, always wonderful having you on the show. And I think you've managed to talk about Marx in a way that provides an enormous amount of insight. I like that you have a sort of cold, calculating, cynical view of humanity, which I think is the way that we ought to be. And it's interesting to hear about Marx's affinity with someone like Milton Friedman, a hero of mine and Jason's. And we look forward to having you back on the show sometime soon.
Well, thank you very much. Great set of questions, and it was a pleasure as always. So thank you, gentlemen.